Alright. Hi, I'm Jaehanan, and I'm on the side that believes that the U.S. should have entered the war earlier.
Hi, I'm Cindy Lim, and I'm on the side that U.S. should not have entered the war earlier.
Alright.
Yeah.
So I go first. So so there are several reasons why I believe that the U.S. should have entered 1st, and these are really big reasons that you should really hear out. So firstly, um, one of the major reasons why U.S. did join the war was because of Pearl Harbor, which is understandable, and it was devastating, and it was a tactical country that kind of initiated it all. However, if the U.S. was to enter the war a lot earlier,
Yeah.
let's say in 1939, when the rest of the Allies did, the U.S. could have saved plenty of lives, and the war could have ended a lot quicker, and Pearl Harbor did not need to happen. It's also the issue that you also have to consider that Germany, Hitler stated that if there was someone who stood in his way and actually told him to stop, then he may have actually just stopped right there. And America, they could have done this. America has the force. It has the military force that is very dominant. It is one of the world powers. And so if America joined in, there is a chance that Germany may have been afraid or have been a little bit less willing to continue on with the war. And if anything, it may have even been avoided. And as promised, it could have been ended within like 6 months.
Yeah.
Or well, perhaps a bit longer.
Okay. Before you go on, I'd like to make some points on that. First, on your first argument about how it could have saved lives, yes, it is true that if the U.S. had intervened there, more lives could have been saved. But then again, within the country, there is also a domestic issue. As you know, that most of the U.S. citizens were strongly against entering the war because of the tragedies of World War One, and also they were recovering from the Great Depression. So even if the U.S. did join the war earlier, it would have had kind of a lukewarm support from the citizens, right? And since support from the country itself is very vital in total wars like this, maybe the U.S. would have been decimated if it had entered the war earlier, before the Pearl Harbor incentive. As terrible as it was, it definitely was an incentive.
I understand that. However, you also have to consider England was in the same position. They were very, very reluctant to join the war, but after their first battle, they realized the Nazi Blitz, where the British soldiers, the Allies, they just got annihilated, and then it was a wake-up call. They realized that this could be a real problem. This was a war that was going to last, and it was going to be very impacting. In U.S., if they joined during that time or similar, they would have realized the same issue. This was not going to be something that was just going to be a European problem. This is a worldwide issue. And so they only realized this after Pearl Harbor. But if they were to join the war earlier and experience how terrifying the Nazis could really be, they would find the motivation fast. It would struck them hard. And then because of that, they would realize and they joined the war a lot sooner. And also, you also mentioned that. Uh, what was your argument? The argument you stated that
Domestic support.
the domestic support. No. There was something else. There was something else. You stated two arguments. One was domestic support, and then there was. Alright, for now, never mind. I'll just state my next argument. The other reason that I believe that U.S. should have joined the war earlier is because of the USSR. Um, so during the time the Soviet Union was in power, but they were in the war in the east side of Germany, right? And clearly, the Soviet Union, they were having a lot of problems. A lot of soldiers were dying, and in order to relieve the pressure, they needed the Western borders to have a little bit more pressure, so that Hitler would send more over. However, this kept getting delayed, especially with D-Day, right? But if the U.S. was to join a lot earlier, the pressure could have been relieved a lot earlier, and what else could happen is the Cold War could have been avoided. The tension between USSR and the U.S. that progressed for the next 50, 40 years, that could just never have happened. And all this tension that built up to now, it could all be relieved.
Wait, but then, okay, just because, yes, the late entry of the U.S. into the war to relieve the pressure on the USSR was definitely one of the causes of the Cold War, but just because the U.S. did enter the war earlier didn't mean the Cold War was necessarily could have been prevented, because the USSR was already an emerging power, right? And ever since the USSR became communist in 1917, its became a conflicting power with the Western democracies in Western Europe. So perhaps just because the U.S. had helped the USSR before doesn't mean the Cold War and the rivalry between the two countries would have ceased. So
Of course, I agree with this. Yeah, it's never just one reason that resulted in USSR. But however, you got to realize most fights, a lot of the arguments that happen is often they're not petty, but then something slightly minor that can grow and expand to something huge. And this was an issue between what were once allies, and then there was conflict. And this is argued to be one of the biggest reasons. And so, if perhaps despite the other reasons, maybe those could have been forgiven, and then I'm saying the Cold War may have either been delayed or it could have been less likely to happen. But yeah,
okay.
yeah, do you have
Yeah. Okay. So also on the Pearl Harbor point, um, since my stand is the U.S. should not have entered the war earlier, I can also expand this, and I also believe that the U.S. actually should not have been directly involved in the war, to a certain extent. I mean, I do agree that many lives were lost because the U.S.'s late entry into the war, but actually, the U.S. not entering the war might have been a more efficient tactic. For example, if the U.S. hadn't responded to the Pearl Harbor because it was a sort of a big provocation by Japan, right? Since Japan's main goal was to annihilate all U.S. fleets in Pearl Harbor, and since it failed, the U.S. still had naval fleets left to carry on the blockade around Japan, which was blocking their oil supply. And obviously, without oil, Japan can't continue its expansion nor the war in the Pacific. So, actually, maybe the U.S. should not have been entered in direct conflict with Germany and the other European powers, but perhaps it should have just stayed out and continued the blockade around Japan despite Pearl Harbor, and that might have stopped the Japan's Pacific invasion much more efficiently. So, what do you think?
Wait, so are you stating that U.S. should have joined earlier in order to actually stop the
No,
blockade
no,
in
no.
Japan, or
No, I'm saying that the U.S. maybe should not have responded to Pearl Harbor and entered. Actually, okay. So my point is, the U.S. should have entered the war later, right? Yeah, it should not have entered the war earlier. So it should not have entered the war earlier than Pearl Harbor or on the Pearl Harbor point.
well, I disagree because in the case of Pearl Harbor, you have to recognize the U.S. was extremely lucky. Japan's plan was to destroy all of America's fleet. It was under those conditions, if that did happen, and if they were successful, which was their goal, then they had a fighting chance against America. It was under the circumstances that America did have a few ships that were out already patrolling that they were able to succeed. But in the case that if Pearl Harbor didn't happen, U.S. could have had all of their fleet, their entire Navy force, and with that, they could have taken care of the issue a lot quicker. It was with fleets gone, it would have been we, if we had a larger navy, if the navy wasn't destroyed, you could transport soldiers a lot faster. Issues could have been solved. The blockade would have been a lot more efficient. So resources would not have even those that leaked in. Those were less likely to happen, and also America would just have a lot more equipment to take care of Japan, and they would even have ships that could help out with either D-Day or any other invasion tactics that they had. So the Navy is a huge importance in the Army, and Pearl Harbor, it destroyed a large portion, a huge amount of it. And so if Pearl Harbor didn't happen, a lot of money would have been saved. A lot of money that they invested in the Navy that could have been saved, and the billions that they lost, it also may not have happened.
Yeah, the U.S. Before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. certainly would have been better equipped for the war. But then the thing is, the U.S. didn't want to enter the war earlier, so that kind of defeats the whole purpose. Like, even if a country does have excellent resources, like fit enough to win the war, if it didn't want to enter the war in the first place, then isn't that I believe that's the country's right to decide whether it is going to enter a conflict or not, especially a conflict that is not in its own continents.
But you have to recognize all these other countries, even in Europe, France and England, they did not want to join this war. This was an issue they wanted to keep on avoiding. You heard what happened before the war. Germany, they do one thing. They take over Poland, and then the League of Nations, they just let it slip by, and they tell them, okay, you can stop now. But they didn't. They kept continuing, and so you can tell that the Allied forces, they were really reluctant to join the war. They knew this was going to be something that they didn't want to happen. But what woke them up was how severe, how dangerous the Nazi forces were, how powerful they could really be. And so, if America was to witness this, if American soldiers were to know that this could actually spread over, if they knew that if they didn't help, the British could have been a lot more trouble. And so, in that kind of case, I think they would have snapped away a lot sooner. They would realize that it doesn't have to be Pearl Harbor. It has to be people realizing. Uh, the thing about Pearl Harbor is it's not only the death; it is also the recognition of how dangerous the new war style is. It's different from World War One. It's not about trenches. It's not digging holes and hiding from the bullets all the time. This is you have planes coming in with bombs, torpedoes, and stuff, and it's much larger scale. And so it's something shocking. It's new. That's what impacts the people. It's not only the guns and bullets. It's now right? These big explosions, and so I think that's what that would probably have been the waking call to most.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Wait. First on the first the European powers, the Allies. Of course, everyone was reluctant to join the war because who wants to go to war? But European countries like France and when they were directly invaded by the Nazi forces, so they had no choice but to retaliate or be taken over by the Nazis. But on the other hand, America wasn't invaded, even though it probably would have been invaded later on in the war if they didn't stop the war in Europe. It wasn't invaded at the time, so they didn't have the direct provocation to respond to. Also, the wait, what was your second point again? I had a good response.
I had three arguments. One was um, to prevent the Cold War, Germany would not have continued on with the war, and Pearl Harbor could
Yeah.
So
No.
the bombs, the explosions.
Darn it. What was the last part of your speech again?
uh, so wait, what was it? So I was talking about the impact of Pearl Harbor. You have to.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
a scenario, right?
Yeah, right, okay. So it's not like the U.S. didn't know what was going on in Europe. It already was aware of the wars that the Hitler was Nazis were waging, like the Blitz wars. It's just that the Congress and the people did recognize the horrors of it, and it did recognize a lot of people died from it. But then the U.S. was still reluctant to go to war because it realized it would put their own country at stake as well. So um, so the welfare of the U.S. citizens was also in the U.S.'s mind. It wouldn't sacrifice its own citizens, especially when the U.S. didn't have as much manpower as the USSR to, like for example, to create a buffer or anything. Its own citizens' lives were at stake, so it was reluctant to join the war. That's understandable.
I have to slightly disagree with you. In terms of manpower, yes, I agree. USSR did have a greater manpower, but in terms of resources and money, America had a lot more. The war helped get them out of the Great Depression, and that's true. Oh, that was the point that I was also going to
Yeah. Great Depression.
You mentioned that the Great Depression, that's how America kind of got out of it because they joined the war later, but I disagree. If they were to join in 1939, the reason why America got out of the Great Depression was the amount of money they were making from it. They were selling weapons food and resources to their allied forces, and that's how money kept coming in, and they give out loans that help other nations. And this is how America got rich again. But if the U.S. was to join earlier, this would have been any different. The same amount of resources still would have been sold. Soldiers would have been sent in, and the Great Depression would have been stepped out of. Anyway.
Yeah, wait. On that point, the main years that the U.S. recovered from the Great Depression due to its not exactly entry into the war, but involvement, like shipping supplies. It was between 1940 and 1941. So if it had entered before that, like the 1940 and 1941 years was when the U.S.'s economy finally began to go uphill, and they were finally making some profit, and unemployment was getting better. So if it had entered before that, perhaps the war would have devastated them before they recovered.